South Africa must implement decisive action to address its mounting debt burden. As a matter of fact, several actions in order to catalyze economic growth, according to the International Monetary Fund. Now, the Washington-based lender has proposed a fiscal adjustment of 1% of gross domestic product annually over the next 3 years to bring the nation's public debt to more sustainable levels of between 60 and 70% of GDP within the next decade. Now, key recommendations include wage discipline, overhauling struggling state-owned enterprises like Eskom and Transnet, and tightening government procurement processes to curb wasteful spending. With gross debt projected to hit 74.7% of GDP by March 2025, the IMF warns that unchecked fiscal deficits and weak growth could further constrain South Africa's already fragile economy. Now, I have two professors to discuss this. Professor Andrew Roux, economics, of course, is a professor of economics at University of Stellenbosch Business School from Northern Cape Town. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good day, and good day to your viewers and other colleagues.
Of course. Professor Waldo Krugell, an economist also from Northwest University, purchased from South Africa, also joins us for this conversation. You're welcome.
Good day. Good morning.
Okay, let me start with Professor Roux. Now, what are the potential economic consequences if South Africa fails to implement the IMF's recommended fiscal adjustments?
Well, let me start off by saying that this is not only the IMF that's singing this tune. Many have been singing this tune for a number of years. It's not a new idea. What is perhaps a bit different this year is that, the conditions, the rules of engagement are different this year. So on the more positive side, and it's early days yet, but in some ways the economy is looking a little bit better. Inflation's come down nicely, interest rates showing signs of falling, somewhat better business sentiment. And that probably links up to the second new rule of engagement, and that is, of course, having a government of national unity. Early days, it's got to show its mettle. And then thirdly, and less positive, of course, is what we could call the Trump offensive, which means that the global environment for the country is not as great as it was a little while ago. But given all of that, the point remains that the government debt is uncomfortably high. Now, I think you would have seen in the IMF report, we know this, that 17 odd years ago, the debt to GDP ratio was a very acceptable, 20-something%. After that, it shot up, accelerated to now 70% plus. 70% plus is not the worst in the world, by no stretch of the imagination. The concern is more about the application, the use of this debt that's accumulated over the last couple of decades or last 10 years or so. Quite a lot has been used to help finance current spending on civil servant salaries, social grants, and even sometimes paying interest on previous government debt. And that's where the concern really comes in. If that new debt had been used to perhaps build new infrastructure or to boost education and health, we wouldn't be all that worried. But it's been unproductive spending of those huge amounts of debt. So as I say, it's not a new idea, not a new tune, but it's just confirming what we think, and that is that with unsustainable levels of debt, it's difficult to bring about longer-term sustainable growth.
Okay, Professor Krugell, as at December 2024, South Africa's debt portfolio was around $310.9 billion. We're looking at around 70% of GDP. Now, what's your own perspective on how it affects governance and the country's economy?
I think what we can sensibly add to what Prof. Roux already said is that this level of debt may not be that high, but the interest that we pay on this debt is particularly high, and the interest burden on our national debt has just escalated away from emerging market peers or any other comparison that you want to make. And that is eating into the available money for other things in the budget. So if you first have to pay 20 cents in every rand of tax income as interest on debt, and then you have to make do with the remaining 80 cents, that's when we start talking about the possibilities of a debt trap or a fiscal cliff. The burden simply becomes too big for the budget, and it limits the room for government to do the things that would sensibly need to get done, like that spending on education, health, etc. So bringing this under control is really a serious matter, and we're looking forward to see how the Minister speaks to this in the budget speech tomorrow afternoon.
Okay, well, we understand it's a serious matter, Professor Roux, but then we saw a bit of decline in the debt portfolio, $311.3 billion. We saw it reduced to $310.9 billion, quite marginal. But then some people would say that it seems as though the economic reforms of Cyril Ramaphosa seems to be working. Do you think?
Well, I think it's a bit early, it's a bit premature to say they're working superbly. But they are showing signs, yes. Phase one of the reforms are working. And by the way, the reforms are, again, fairly standard. I think in many ways, it's better late than never, but the reforms are aimed really at getting the basics right, something we should have been looking at a long time ago. So reliable electricity, less assistance to wasteful state-owned enterprises, government discipline, stamping out corruption. These are kind of, I would say, getting the basics right. And you've got to start somewhere. It's early days yet, but yes, we see signs of promise. One of the constraints, of course, is, especially when we start talking about ratios, is that the number below the line, so it's debt divided by GDP. The GDP is not growing all that fast. In fact, it's growing very sluggishly. So that means that in its own right is escalating, is elevating the actual ratio. So if we were able to grow 3%, then the debt ratio would probably decline from current levels. But now becomes a very interesting, almost vicious cycle, because if we are aiming for, we should be, fiscal consolidation, in the short term, that might actually compromise short-term economic growth. In the longer term, it's a prerequisite. So it's one of those politically uncomfortable situations, and politics does play a role here, where you need to make a short-term almost sacrifice for the sake of longer-term growth. And foremost amongst those sacrifices, from a political point of view, is going to be how he deals with the still large civil servant wage bill, which, by the way, is close to 15% of GDP, one of the highest ratios in the world. And I mean that the entire world, not just developing world. So you need to cut back on that, or at least curb that, but then you've got to think about the politics as well. Yes, as your slide is showing there. It's difficult.
Okay, so Professor Krugell, in terms of consultations, political interference on the coalition of governments, how possible will it be for the South African government to implement what IMF is recommending, fiscal adjustments of 1% of GDP annually over 3 years? Would it be possible then too, if it's not able to meet that requirement, will there be dire economic consequences?
I think they are recommending a particularly large adjustment, considering the fact that the economy is not growing fast. If we do grow faster, those problems go away. If GDP goes up, it's much easier to solve those ratio problems. Otherwise, cutting spending is next to impossible. Tackling the wage bill is very difficult, and if you add on to that the grant system and bailing out of SOEs, those sort of take up significant chunks of the budget, and trying to limit that is not straightforward. We've seen the consequences of long-term cost-cutting measures that are not strategic, if I can put it that way. In the past, the wage bill always ended up being higher than the amount budgeted for, but that problem then gets pushed back to the provincial level, where they just don't fill vacant positions and cannibalize other parts of the budget in order to pay those wage increases. But in the end, service delivery suffers. So I think if the plan is to cut more spending, it has to be done in a very clever way. Otherwise, we might end up with fiscal problems and service delivery problems at the same time. And that could have significant consequences for the economy.
Okay, Professor Roux.
May I just...
Okay, you want to react to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, actually. I mean, on your slide a couple of seconds ago, you showed the, regarding the public service wage bill, early retirement schemes. Now, that's a very convenient way of saving money, but in the same token, you're losing years and years of expertise and skills and experience. So even that can be self-defeating, just to add on to what's just been said.
All right, that's noted. Professor Roux, let's leave the domestic solutions for a while and quickly tap into something outside of what South Africa might do. Now, we understand that the government has been involved in several international discussions on debts and how it affects Africa as a continent. Now, there have been challenges when it comes to paying back, and the South African government has been advocating for sustainable financing and some sort of debt reforms as a leeway or a way out for African countries to deal with their debt burden. Do you think that can work? Is it an option that we might consider?
You know, I don't think South Africa needs that. I don't think our situation is that bad that we need to appeal to creditors for some kind of debt forgiveness or special schemes. But I wouldn't want us to do that. That would be kind of be admitting that we're not doing a good job, and I wouldn't want us to do that either. I can't help thinking about earlier years when we had similar, I suppose, suggestions regarding the highly indebted poor countries, asking for debt forgiveness, but then being subjected to the so-called Washington Consensus and conditions being imposed. We don't want to go that route. I think we can sort it out ourselves. As has been pointed out, it's not going to be easy. Especially not politically, but there are some ways where we could save on the spending side. You know, there's so much wasteful spending. Being cut back on that, that'll make a difference. And then I think the minister will be very harsh tomorrow on bailing out or not bailing out a number of non-for-profit organizations or state-owned enterprises. I think that but I don't think that's going to be a big thing going forward.
Yeah, so that's the elephant in the room, and I'll put it to Professor Krugell. We're talking about boosting economic growth and, of course, reducing spending and ensuring that we have a buoyant fiscal position for the South African government. So where do you think the South African government and the Treasury should take their stance, looking at Transnet and Eskom?
I think in the case of Eskom, the bailout is ongoing. So that agreement's been made, and they are already planning for about a 40 billion rand cash injection, taking over debt this year, and another 70 billion rand swap of Eskom debt for SA government debt. So that's ongoing. The bigger issue is at Transnet, and they've appealed for an equity injection. But the Minister of Finance, I think, has sensibly emphasized that they can use the infrastructure budget facility for specific projects under strict conditions, and that some of those conditions are always linked to involving the private sector, whether it's in finance or in operation. And he would see some progress there before he even considers further guaranteeing of debt or equity of any kind. So I think the Transnet case is very specific because it is possible to draw in the private sector, and this has been agreed upon, but it's happening very slowly. And the minister has the power in hand to really force that process forward by denying them a bailout.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Waldo Krugell. Now, we understand we're actually out of time. We might not be able to entertain more responses, but then we understand that South Africa's debt to service costs actually, consumes about 20% of government revenue. So at this point, what is needful is fiscal prudence on the part of government. Well, we hope that will be possible right now for the coalition government. But then Professor Andrew Roux, an economist at the University of Stellenbosch Business School, and of course Professor Waldo Krugell, an economist at Northwest University. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us on the show.
Thank you.